Welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is where we talk about love and romantic relationships. So let's go ahead and get started. So, in this chapter, we're going to talk about things like sculpting diversity, like who ends up being with whom, and what is this thing called love that everyone kind of wants, but it's kind of hard for us to define what it actually is. We'll talk about the rituals involved in forming relationships, mate selection, and then sex before relationships. So, let's talk about when two people start a romance, what exactly is going on there? And let me. And why is it that people who are similar tend to fall in love and form relationships with other people who are very much like themselves? In fact, if I had to guess in terms of who you were going to end up being with, I would say you're probably going to end up being with someone like you. Same income level, same education level, same race, same background. Because I don't know, that's just what tends to happen, and we will actually go into that a little bit more as to why that occurs. So let's talk about social scripts and how they influence what we do. A social script is a kind of a mental pattern. Maybe we read about in a book, maybe we saw in a movie in which these two people kind of meet and then they kind of do these things before they end up forming a relationship. And if we see that enough and we see our friends do it and we read about it, then we're kind of like, that's just kind of what you do. They tell us how to behave in these relationships. Now, sometimes they're contradictory, sometimes they're not always healthy for us to do, but we kind of follow them because we're social creatures and that's kind of what we do. So let's talk about the shifting scripts. Dating used to play a much bigger role in how we meet people. Increasingly, we are accepting people who are living together before they're married, and we're even expecting them to live together before they get married or form a committed relationship. Other things is that we are increasingly uh, older as a group who are still looking for relationships, and we're increasingly have come from previous relationships, maybe divorce relationships, and are back in the dating market. And then technology has helped us meet and maintain our romantic relationships, or maybe I should say, has helped us, as most couples seem to fight a lot about what the other person said via Instagram or other technologies like that. But they seem to be not going away, and they're playing a role in how we meet people and then how we communicate and maintain that relationship. So let's talk about love, romantic and utilitarian love, because we love big words like utilitarian. So let's talk about love. Love, we often associate romance and partnering marriage with love. Love is about affection and concern for other people. Uh, Whereas romantic love is a type of love. You may love your grandmother, but you're probably not romantically in love with your grandmother, because romantic love is about devotion and more about sexual desire, even if it's not out there so obvious. There's something related to sexual desire. And passion, devotion, whereas maybe the other kind of love is about concern or affection. So we don't necessarily know what it is. We kind of elevate it, but we're skimpy on the details. Not exactly sure how those what those really are. Um, One thing to realize is that romantic love is more of an ideal. Uh, this woman, Anne Swindler, she calls it a mythical idea. We have things like love at first sight, and we're gonna know that person. How do you know when you love somebody? You just know, right? It's like it's sort of like a mythical, can't quite define it. You know it in your gut. It's so powerful that it can overcome flaws and financial difficulties. You fall in love with someone who has a bus pass, and it's just like we feel like it's eternal and it's not fading. And so if we end up like being with someone and then it doesn't work out, we're like, well, I didn't really love that person, right? Why? Because the love should be able to conquer it, and the love shouldn't fade because of those things. And the problem is that, like, it's it's not really like, logical. It's, some other part of our brain is going with that. And so in some ways that's kind of a problem, because we're willing to say, like, well, if I don't feel a certain way toward this person, then I must not be in love. And if I'm not in love, then it wasn't meant to be. Whereas part of me goes, well, listen, maybe you just need to work a little harder at the relationship, and it would work out fine. It would work out well, but we need to be more committed. But if we think that love is, mythical and powerful, and it kind of comes and goes without our understanding or choice, then, it's like, gosh, we're kind of a victim of love. So I'm sure there's a song called "The Victim of Love," right? Uh, so what else? We think of falling in love at a young age, and then that love is going to remain throughout our life. However, this is not historical. Historically, love was not the expectation. You did not have to really feel this affection. It was not common to actually love each other if you were a spouse. Or if it was the expectation, you didn't have to feel that before you got married and had kids with them. And so, realize that we have this new expectation that didn't always have to be there in order for us to be married and have children and be functional with somebody in the past. However, anthropologists have found some version of romantic love in all cultures, but it's going to show up a little bit different. All right. Uh, Romantic love carries its own social script in terms of how you actually get there. So this is changing, of course, with our movies and with our books, which influence and tell us what to expect. And so, for instance, here, the "I love you," right? It used to be that when people would say "I love you," then it was like, "I want to marry you," or "let's talk about getting engaged," and that sort of thing. And now "I love you" is like this powerful moment, but there's no real like clear path in terms of, okay, therefore we should do what? It's not really sure there. So that kind of adds some, I think, to some of the nervousness and anxiety around romance today, because people are unsure of the steps and what things mean. Like, what does "I love you" mean? All right, making it work. We often talk about romantic love, but we oftentimes what we also really need, and what's probably going to keep things going, is something more like utilitarian love. Utilitarian is just kind of useful. Like, does it work? Right? So, like, you buy a car and you may not love it, but you might say, well, it's not really about me loving it. I need it to get from point A to point B safely. And if it does that, then it's a utilitarian love. I love the fact that it just works. It works well. So this may be the practical side of relationships. Like, yeah, a woman may say, yeah, I had a boyfriend in college, and it was great fun hanging out with him. We did all these amazing things, but he wanted to be a poet and live on the beach, and I don't want to do that. So I married Jim, and Jim is a nice guy, and Jim has a good job and is a good father, and that's why I married Jim. Why? Because it's like it's gonna work, and the other guy is on the beach somewhere playing guitar, right? So, um, you know, it is what it is. The truth is, actually, women tend to be more utilitarian than men. Men tend to have more of an idealized, like, romance is more important, whereas women tend to be like more like, no, we need like a house and bills and stability and commitment. So, romantic relationships. Although romantic relationships need not be sexual, they usually include at least the anticipation of sexual interaction, even if that's like, way down the road, or it's just maybe just in someone's mind. Um, let's see. The definition of romantic relationships is not precise because the relationships themselves are not precise. Again, we find it hard to come up with words to describe these things. So this imprecision includes a lack of fixed beginnings or endings, and that they may not even be called the same thing by both partners. This is someone who would say, define the relationship, DFR, I think that's anyway. People like where are we at? What are we? What are we doing? And in the past, people would have like labels like we are dating, we're going steady, in we're engaged, and like we're married. And a lot of times people today, they don't have those markers for that, and so people are somewhat kind of lost during that. So love feels more fragile, right? Because it's like built upon personal choice, and some people are like, it's just about what we want, and we're not trying to follow any of the society's structures because we're independent. And that kind of sounds good, maybe feels good, but sometimes it's like, actually, then what are we? I don't know what to expect in the future. And I feel like this probably impacts women more because they, especially if they're sexually active, then it's like, well, what if we have a child? What are we going to do with that child? Because that like women are oftentimes looking for signs of commitment. Men a little bit less, and so I feel like in some ways this ambiguity, the I don't know factor, what's going on in the relationship, impacts women more than it does men. All right, rituals. The expectations that we're going to do this, and then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. These are rituals. So, dating emerged in the early 20th century. So it emerged around the time of the automobile, right? You have technology, which allows men to go cruising around town without having to worry about a horse and feeding it and caring for it. Although I guess cars need caring, especially in the beginning. But what it did was it allowed men and women, young men and women, to be independent of their parents. And so you can imagine in the beginning it was probably kind of controversial because what it replaced was courtship. And so, new system in which people are being independent, and they're having like meetings, and they're going places, and it's away from the parents, and is more casual than it is today. I want to emphasize that today people, when they're going on dates, they're more, I think it's more serious. Whereas like example of more serious, meaning like in the past, like a guy could walk up to a random girl and be like, hey, do you want to go out tonight? We'll have dinner and go dancing. And the woman might just say yes, like, and it would be like, it wouldn't mean a whole lot to her, and it wouldn't mean a whole lot to him. It was just more casual. And then the next night, someone else could show up in the woman's life and be like, hey, do you want to go to the movies? And she would be like, yes, right? And that would not be considered unusual because it was just more casual back then. So so it was much more casual. A woman in the 1950s is going on 12 dates per month with 5 different men, right? So much more casual, and it was going to be like leading to marriage at some point, but in the meantime you're meeting lots of people and kind of finding out what works. Again, in the 1950s, most people aren't going to be having sex outside of a commitment because we didn't have birth control, and so that was not an expectation for dating. And so dating was popular, and it became seen as traditional, but realize that it was replacing courtship, right? And then in the 1950s, with the advent of the pill and the sexual revolution, and kind of down with the old ways of doing things, we begin to worry about the death of romance here. All right, so despite the decline of the dating system, several of its components and practices remain. People are still going on dates. It's just that the dating is not the predominant system. And people can go on dates, and it may mean various things to various people. Uh, and it may be about pursuing somebody that you're sexually attracted with. It might just be that you want to have fun with somebody. It may be a way of meeting people, um, and so. But again, some people who have been dating for a long time may not have ever gotten past that dating stage, at least in their own minds. So that makes it somewhat difficult to understand because some people, they don't have like a title for their relationship, even though they may have been together for several months and are exclusive. They're not dating or with other people. Uh, Dating is difficult to generalize, right? And the fact that different groups, different age groups, different people at different stages of life are going to have different attitudes about dating. Um, Teenage relationships are largely shaped by whatever's normal in their community or what their family or friends say about it. It tends to be, though, that peer groups are often segregated either by race or ethnicity, and so even to this day we don't see as much interracial dating or interethnic dating as there would be if it was just kind of a random, if people dated like if you put everyone's name into a pot and just kind of drew out names, that would be much more equal than we actually see today. So, in terms of public versus private, the old court system, old courtship, the old courtship system was viewed as a public matter. What was courtship? Courtship was in the 1800s, 1700s, in which men really, they would go courting, and courting was about finding a wife, and it's a family affair, and you could kind of think of it as like joining families. If you've ever read books like Pride and Prejudice, then this is about, courting was a really important part because the families, their welfare was caught up in the marriage of their children. So much more family oriented, much more public oriented. Um, so today, couples oftentimes spend time in private. Oh no, sorry. This was the couple in courtship. Uh, the woman's home was where the man came to spend time with the woman and find out if he wanted to marry her before asking. But the local community is deciding, like, should this be a thing? Today, we are dating oftentimes in public. People are going to the movies, they're going to restaurants, and I want to say dances, but I can't remember the last time anyone's told me they've been to a dance. So certainly not anybody under the age of 40. So I'm not really sure. Maybe a club, maybe that's where they're going for dates. But anyway, it's a public situation, meaning like people are going out on dates and they're usually in public. They're not, I don't know, in isolated places or behind closed doors. One thing to realize is that's good for business. The dating arena moves from the woman's house to the movie theater or the restaurant. Man's spending money here, which is maybe one of the reasons why we don't have as many dates today, because I think a lot of young men are not interested in spending lots of money on restaurants, as services like restaurants and things like that have gone up in price compared to what they used to be. Um, and and so the the relationship, at least the beginning of it, has kind of moved from the family arena where it's happening in the home and the family has a really big influence, to the public arena, right? And so that has kind of changed the dynamics of that. Uh, Today, if dating is sort of declining in influence, people are oftentimes socializing in mixed groups, which I don't really consider that a date. I consider that hanging out. It's fine, nothing's wrong with that, but that's not a date. Uh, and so the purpose of this socializing in mixed gender groups is to get to know the person, but also if it doesn't work out, then it's not as awkward because you're not stuck at a restaurant with somebody, because there's other people to kind of hang out with, and some people feel more comfortable around people they already know well, and so you get to kind of see that person in their group, and that's a nice thing because people are oftentimes heavily influenced by their friends. So if you want to know somebody, what they're like, you can hang around with their friends and see what they're actually like. And so 90% of students, at least at Stanford's not a normal university. That's very prestigious. It's like the Ivy League, but of the West Coast. But anyway, so among the elite university students, 90% of them had been on at least one date. So uh, the ideal relationship in America is egalitarian, equal, right, between men and women, or at least during yeah, egalitarian. I was going to say between gay and lesbian, but the reality is that's not going to be as much of an issue there. Uh, but despite the desire for an equal relationship, the women are expecting men to take the lead in forming those dates, right? So that's why I think I mentioned that earlier, that men are oftentimes not taking the lead and women don't want to take the lead, and so it leads to people not going on very many dates. Research shows that men in college are more likely than women to have a sexual goal from the date, whereas women are less interested in this casual sex from the date and more interested in developing a romantic relationship. So in some ways, people will describe this as a dance between men who want to have sex earlier and women who want to have sex later. And so there's sort of that volleying for power between those. On college campuses where there's less men, men have had more power in those dynamics, so they're having sex a little bit earlier because women feel like there's not that many men to go around. So if I don't have sex with him, he may not be interested in forming a romantic relationship with me later on. Right. Okay, hooking up culture. When I was in high school, I think Dave Matthews wrote a song about a hookup culture. I think it was, never mind. Hooking up. Hooking up is about casual sex without commitment, without exclusivity, without saying it's just you and me, babe. And this is separate from dating and separate from pursuing a relationship. You could think about usually sex is a part of a relationship, part of a romantic relationship or a marital relationship, or whereas hooking up is just, it's like, I'll take the sex, but you can keep the rest of the relationship. Like, I'm not interested in it, right? It's separate. Well, I guess you could say sex is a relationship, but usually there's more to it than a relationship than just sex. So if it's just about the sex, then that's an example of hooking up. For most people, it can include all kinds of forms of sexual interactions, from just kissing to intercourse. Um, it is difficult to know how common it is. I guess you ask people questions, but there's sort of a dance around it, which is that you don't talk about it afterward, or you blame the alcohol, or you say that it was nothing. So that, and somewhat, it makes it hard to really calculate the data, but we have some here. And you just ask people like the number of hookups that you've had. And by the way, people who want future committed relationships have just as many hookups as those who don't want or imagine themselves in committed relationships in the future. So what do we have here? This is the number of hookups reported by college students, right? So the largest group here is the number of people who say they've had none. 38% say that they've never had a hookup. 1 to 3 is 26%. So between those who have had none and 1 to 3, that's about 60 some odd percent. So that's the largest group. Maybe that's 70. I don't know. 2 and 6, 5, 6, 60. No, 72%. So that's the majority of people. Only 13% have had 10 or more hookups, right? 4 to 9, 20, another like quarter of the people. So there are some apps that promote this. The key difference between dating and hooking up is the expectation of sexual contact at the first encounter, right? It's supposed to be meaningless, but not always meaningless. Sometimes people end up actually like forming a relationship with the person that they have a hookup experience with. That's sort of like the sex first model. Not a great plan in terms of forming a relationship there. Um, Often viewed positively by men who want to hook up with different people. That's no surprise. We consider men who sleep with a lot of women to be masculine in our culture. We don't have the same thing for women, so women are less likely to view this as a sign of success, right? In fact, women that are doing this are oftentimes saying that they don't want a serious relationship, but are looking for sex, again, separated from the other parts of the relationship. Maybe they don't have time, or they're not interested in a relationship at the moment. So, problem here related to sexual assault, it is enhanced by the presence of alcohol and drugs, which is oftentimes related to the hookup. I think that alcohol and sex causes us to maybe do things that we otherwise wouldn't do, either because we're ashamed to do them or we don't have the desire to do them. Connecting online. So this is grown in its influence in that people are able to meet people online as opposed to face to face. And I guess the big advantage here is that you can search for specific factors. You want a certain person who's in a certain area with a body type or political affiliation or just, a certain religion. That is way easier to do on an app than it would be on a I guess you could go to a group. Like if it was a religious group, you could go there, but maybe it'd be harder to find. Certainly harder to find than an app. So, yeah. So a lot of people are using this. 35% of adults under 30 are using online dating sites. Coronavirus played a role in increasing the popularity of this. The benefits of online is that it's efficient, and it allows some people to overcome social isolation. Maybe they would have trouble meeting people in a public place like a coffee shop or a cafeteria, but online you're able to say, "Hey, I'm interested in dating," and then only people who are also interested in dating are also going to be there. At least that would be the hope, anyway. The majority of young women who have used it have reported some form of harassment. This is kind of the dark side of it. They're getting pictures of naked men in their inbox, even though they aren't asking for those. They're being called names. Lying is pretty common, and misrepresentation. So men are saying, I'm taller and richer than they actually are. Women are younger or they're reporting to be younger than they actually are. And so studies show that 1/3 of pictures were substantially inaccurate. So downside of online connections. Okay. But an increasing percentage of serious relationships among people under 30 are beginning online. And so it is something is working here. It is especially important for some people who have few people to choose from in their small geographic area. So, for instance, people who are gay or lesbians are going to have trouble finding people at random because there's not as many of them. So you may find an attractive person in a cafeteria, but the odds of them being gay or lesbian are probably, 5%, 10%, whereas for somebody who's heterosexual, the odds are probably, closer to 90%. And so it makes it a little bit harder for people to find someone in person. Online's a little bit easier. The percentage of adults who met their partners through online dating by age, no surprise here, is that 20% of younger people have met their person online, as opposed to 4% of people who are 65 years and older. But by the way, this is changing. More and more older people, especially if they are looking for new romantic relationships, are turning online. The population of people who are single and looking for relationships has changed. We used to associate single people with being young. Those who are looking for relationships are young, but there's more older people who are interested in finding someone new, in going on dates. One is that we are encouraging people to delay marriage because they need to get a lot of education and pursue their careers first. And so you have a lot of people in their 30s and even 40s who are now, like, kind of for the first time getting serious about finding somebody. As well as people who had previous relationships and they're now divorced or separated and are looking for another partner. So this looks at that today we have less married older adults, and these older adults are more likely to be separated and divorced or never married. So this looks at older adults who are 55 to 75, comparing them to from the 1970s to today, and what you see is less of them are married, more of them are cohabitating, more of them have never been married, and then more of them are separated or divorced. Gay and lesbian relationships specifically, the majority of Americans now find these relationships morally acceptable. However, it doesn't mean that is easy for these groups of people to find partners, because you're going to get opposition from parents and religious leaders and other authorities, and so it's getting easier, but easy would probably be too strong of a word. So. Uh, Same-sex relationships are becoming more acceptable, and probably because of that, people who are younger are coming out of the closet, making their sexual orientation public, right? But this still comes with a price often. Usually it's a price worth paying, by the way, usually, not always. But oftentimes it, it relates to depression and suicidal thoughts are more common among the LGBTQ group. Mate selection. What are the factors that affect this process? So, mate selection is the process by which we choose each other for sexual or romantic relationships. And so one thing to realize here is that we don't necessarily have an equal society where anyone has an equal chance of being in a relationship with someone else. Family dynamics play a key role there. And so the question of what causes certain people to be attractive or want to form a relationship with somebody else? And so one of the thoughts is that maybe it's evolution, that women are looking for men who are going to be good providers and good protectors, and men are looking for women who are going to be fertile and able to bear their children. And so that's sort of the evolutionary perspective. The social interaction perspective says probably what's more important is the fact that we have taught people what to look for through movies and books and role models and things like that. And we're telling people this is what you should want in a partner. And so, here that beauty characteristics may be common. We can see, for instance, a lot of common in women, like thin is a common characteristic that we see in movies, but that doesn't mean that it has evolved biologically. So, for instance, being overly thin can actually make a woman less fertile, and so that wouldn't necessarily come about biologically or evolutionary in that sense. And having an aggressive man doesn't necessarily make for a good provider or somebody that's going to create a good environment for childbearing and rearing. So it may just be that that is what we've seen modeled for us, and that is what we're going after. And specifically here, related to gender, we've focused a lot of the research on women and women's attractiveness, but then when it comes to things like high-heeled shoes, which are really bad for a woman's body, but what they do is that it allows a woman to accent her gender, accent her femininity, calling attention to her hips and waist. And perhaps what it does is it communicates that she is willing to play the gender game. Right? They're doing gender here. That's perhaps what that's about. It accentuates or makes greater the differences between men and women. Right? High heels don't just accentuate the hips; they make women less powerful physically, which many men find attractive. Again, that would not be an evolutionary thing. That would be a social thing. All right. When it comes to race and ethnicity, another term here, homophily, if I'm saying that right. I think I'm saying that right. This is the principle by which similar people have more of a given kind of contact than dissimilar people. Okay, we tend to interact with people who are like us. That's homophily, right? I tend to interact with people who are also college instructors, and I tend to, be around other people with a similar income bracket, right? So if I'm interacting with those people a lot and I was a single person, then it's more likely I'm going to have a romantic relationship with somebody like myself. Okay. Endogamy. This is where we tend to marry people within our group, right? And specifically here along the lines of race and ethnicity. Okay. And so, why is that? Why do we tend to marry people who are the similar race and ethnicity? Well, it kind of goes along with this homophily idea where I am spending a lot of time with people who are like myself, and then that some of those one of those relationships will turn into romance and marriage, right? The idea of utilitarian love, it's just useful, it's easy, it works. That reinforces that. Why? Because people who are like me are going to think like me, and I'll have then expectations about how do we raise our kids, where do we live, what do we do for vacation, how do we treat our in-laws. Well, somebody that's of the same ethnicity as me is likely to have similar ideas. Someone with a different ethnicity than me likely to have different ideas. And so if we value utilitarian love, it just needs to work, well, then it makes sense that we would date somebody of a similar ethnicity. All right, looking at universities and looking at the fact that at a university, people, there are certain groups that tend not to do this, but if you look at men, they are most likely to go on dates with women from their own groups. Now, I think there's some groups, I think Asian women are more likely to date outside of their racial group than they are within their racial group, but there's like separate reasons for that. I think that we that men tend to see Asian women and assume that they are submissive, and I think that's probably why men of various racial groups are interested in dating them. African Americans are the most isolated group in the dating scene. Dates between blacks and whites and Asians and Hispanic were the least common. Even at elite universities, which you could say, hey, everyone at elite university is either really smart or they've got rich parents or they've got something really amazing going on, still that pattern of dating within your own group is really prevalent there. The trend to watch: sex before relationships, right? I feel like 20 years ago we would have had the discussion of sex before marriage or something like that. But anyway, sex before a relationship. The question of if the relationship starts with sex, how does that change them in the long run, right? Where sex becomes the filter by which people determine, like, okay, if the sex is enjoyable, if the sex is good, then perhaps we should pursue a relationship. And if it's not that first encounter, then we perhaps not. And so it may hasten the demise. This may increase the odds that this relationship is not going to work out. Right? On the other hand, it may be that sex before relationships will help people make better decisions about whether to get into a serious relationship and perhaps decrease the rates of separation and divorce. I don't know. I find that hard to believe. I'm of the opinion that sex oftentimes is a representation of the larger relationship, meaning if they report that they feel satisfied in their sexual relationship, they're likely to feel satisfied with the rest of their relationship, not because like the sex impacts the rest of the relationship. It's just that the rest of the relationship oftentimes impacts the sexual relationship, right? Like that people want to sleep with people who they like and who treat them well, and who tell them that they're attractive, not just in the bedroom, but on a Tuesday, morning when everyone's rushing around trying to do their thing. And so